media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. And first of all, let me just say thank you to those individuals that were sitting in. Of course, we did a live broadcast from New Mexico on Wednesday, but we also had Merrill Matthews as well as Liberty McCarter sitting in this chair covering some of the very important issues. And I don't really have travel plans anytime in the future. As a matter of fact, I was just thinking, since we're going to be talking today with Dr. Doug Groothuis, first we had a trip to Alaska, which is where he grew up, and then to Colorado, New Mexico, which is where he's lived until now. Michigan, of course, I have been to the college that he is part of, which is there in Grand Rapids, Michigan. But let me just real quickly say we're going to spend some time talking with him. But before we do, let me mention that the second hour today, we're going to talk about what is happening. First of all, a 60-40 vote, which finally was able to end the filibuster with a vote on cloture. Still think it's going to be a few days before we can actually formally say that the government shutdown, which has been the longest in history, is ending, but it's certainly moving in that direction. So we'll get into all the details of what that might mean, some of the reaction to it, and then quite a number of other very important pieces as well. Of course, we knew that Zohran Mamdani would be elected, and he was. Got a very good piece today by Peggy Noonan about that, as well as other issues about the election, a piece by Victor Davis Hanson, a piece in the Wall Street Journal, a piece by Cal Thomas. So we'll have quite a bit to cover in the second hour. But we are privileged, as we have been for literally decades, to bring Doug Groothuis to the microphone. He's the Distinguished University Research Professor of Apologetics and Christian Worldview at Cornerstone University and Seminary. In the past, we've talked about his books on Blaise Pascal, on world religions, going all the way back to, I think, the very first interview he did with Marlon Maddox shortly after I was able to interview him time again about the issue of the New Age movement. This particular article we've posted, Revival and Apologetics, which we thought was so apropos since you don't have it yet, but I'll hold up a copy that we are going to be mailing to you soon. This is the December issue of Outlook, which has the title Rumblings of Revival, a piece that I've written on the history of revival, a piece that John Stonestreet has written about revival, a piece that Liberty has written about. And, of course, we're not in revival, but could we be? And what would be the function of worldview and apologetics? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. So, Dr. Douglas Groothuis, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thanks, Kerby. Happy to be back again.
Talk about how this developed. I was reading in your piece here that you were teaching through Richard Lovelace's book, The Dynamics of Spiritual Life, which, by the way, great book, and you were teaching it at Cornerstone Seminary, and a student asked the question, well, what would be the role of apologetics in revival? And you answered, well, I should write on it, and we've now posted it for people to read.
Right. It was a very natural question. And that is a tremendous book. Some people may know that book by Richard Lovelace, Dynamics of Spiritual Life, was very formative on Timothy Keller for his whole philosophy of ministry with his church in New York City. So I thought, well, that's something that all Christians should be praying for and hoping for and working for is revival. And I've been working in the area of apologetics pretty much since when I became a Christian, or at least a few months afterwards. So I thought, how do we relate the two? And I've been listening to some sermons by Martin Lloyd-Jones, the great British preacher who died, I believe, in 1981. But interestingly, in his book on revival, he has some negative things to say about apologetics. And I thought, well, that might be a good place to start. The positive view, I think, is apologetics should be pre-evangelism. It should help lead people to Christ by removing obstacles that they have from placing their faith in Christ as Lord. But I won't read the quote that I have in my article, but the way that Dr. Lloyd Jones understood apologetics was basically a liberal view of trying to make Christianity acceptable to its cultured despisers, so to speak, to use Schleiermacher's word there, which is not my view of apologetics at all.
Mm-mm.
I think we should give the best case we can for the objective truth of Christianity and its pertinence to the whole of life without making any concessions to secular thought. But, there is a way, and I gave that quote earlier, it really is from Schleiermacher about the cultural despisers of Christianity. You can just try to cut out what is offensive to people to make Christianity more acceptable or tolerable, but then it's not really Christianity at all. So I think apologetics can prepare the way for conversion, for evangelism, and that's a significant and crucial part of any real revival is a lot of conversions, people getting more excited to share their faith. And when people don't immediately convert, which they often don't, they may say, well, what about the reliability of the Bible? Or I'm not even sure there is a God, or maybe Jesus is not that much different from Buddha or Confucius or something. So when people have those kinds of comments, that's where apologetics comes in.
Yes. Well, and one of the things that I thought I might just mention as a program note, tomorrow we have David Geisler on the program. There was a book written a number of years ago by his father, Norm Geisler, as well as a co-author who actually, Ron Rhodes, is not healthy, so he decided to step in, and that one is on conviction without compromise, and we're going to talk about the importance of having a true biblical worldview. And one of the things that's kind of intriguing about this, Doug, is the fact that we do see more people reading the Bible. We also see that a significant percentage of them don't believe the Bible is true in all that it teaches. So it's a good illustration that even if we were to have a revival today and there are people in stadiums holding up their hands and praising the Lord, which we are starting to see some of those, what we need to make sure is there isn't just a stirring of the heart, but there is a very significant understanding of truth, biblical truth, and a real conversion of the mind and the head.
Yes, absolutely. You don't want to just make Christianity another religious experience or a lifestyle change or something like that, because it's certainly a worldview that presents itself as objectively true. Paul says, let God be true, though everyone be a liar, in Romans 3:4. So the truth stands on the character of God himself. And of course, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So real revival is going to be a revival in belief in objective truth and that it's knowable, and that the truth of Christianity is the most important truth we could ever know. And it needs to be made known far and wide and needs to be applied. It's not just Jesus is Lord and try to live a good life. It's the Christian worldview based on an inerrant scripture. The Bible is true, is knowable, and relates to the whole of life. So people get all frothy with the religious experiences and say Jesus a lot, but are not truly converted. Well, then that's not a revival at all. That's just another social movement.
Let's take a break. Come back, we're going to talk about revival and apologetics, very well written, as you might imagine, from Douglas Groothuis. And again, we will go through some of the pieces of his argument and do a little bit of a critique of some things that have been written in the past. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What does it mean to be a human being? That is a question raised in Psalm 8. What is man? That question is at the heart of so many social issues such as human rights, gender, sexuality, and artificial intelligence. Dr. Carl Trueman discusses the issue of biblical anthropology in his article in World Magazine. He was on my radio program to discuss the topic by pointing to books that helped him more accurately define a human being. Augustine's Confessions is the first book he mentioned. Augustine, he says, successfully integrates theology, experience, and doxology into his autobiography in a way unmatched by any before or since. His work contradicts the modern idea that to be truly human is to be autonomous, unencumbered self-creators. A second book is Blaise Pascal's Pensées. While Pascal draws from Augustine's anthropology, he brings a modern perspective. His commentary on the materialistic culture of the 17th century French court has many parallels with our entertainment-obsessed world. Why does the king have a jester? Because he fears death, and having nothing else to worry about due to his material wealth and power, needs to be distracted from his mortality. The book, What It Means to Be Human by Carter Snead, is a book of bioethics. It also reminds us that human beings are not defined by autonomy, but obligation and dependency. We should see the body and human embodiment as morally significant. Christians must reject this modern secular worldview that does not see humans as created in the image of God. These books and others he mentions in the article are helpful in bringing us back to a biblical perspective of what it means to be a human being. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Douglas Groothuis with us today, and this particular article is from Worldview Bulletin. Since the very beginning, I've subscribed to it, and we try to post very good articles from time to time about that. And as you go there, you can print out the article because you don't have to have a subscription. But if you do so, you can see there's a way you might want to subscribe and to consider it. And Doug, you start off by, of course, quoting from Psalm 80, but then some other passages, Hosea 4:6, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Proverbs 29:18, where there is no revelation, people cast off restraint. I think it is fair to say that though we should, and all, I hope, are really looking forward to the possibility of revival, there are many signs today, whether you look at the Barna Research studies, Pew, Gallup, some of the things we've done at Pro Ministries and others, to show that a lot of that is in decline. And the sad reality is there's probably more need for the kinds of things that you and I do all the time, because so few individuals who call themselves born-again Christians actually have a biblical worldview.
Well, that's been a problem for a very long time. I don't always look at these Barna statistics because they're kind of depressing in some ways over the years, but that shouldn't make us want to give up. Christianity is, Dallas Willard and J.P. Moreland like to say, is a knowledge tradition, meaning that we can have access to reality through faith, and this faith can be and should be rational. So to know something means you believe it, and you have good reason to believe it's true, and in fact, it is true. So we're not a blind leap in the faith tradition or a religious experience tradition primarily. We are a knowledge tradition. So we need to make known the realities of God to the world through teaching, preaching, life, giving, prayer, all the elements of the Christian life. But we need a very strong, robust teaching ministry and apologetics ministry to fulfill the Great Commission, because Jesus said to take the gospel to the entire world so that people would obey what he taught and they would be converted. Take that to the nations. So one way of viewing the Great Commission intellectually is to take the whole Bible to the whole world and defend it as true and apply it to all of life. And that should keep anybody busy for a lifetime. There's some way that all of us can contribute to that task. Now, I'm a teacher and a writer and a preacher and a mentor. That's how I do it. But however you do it, you can have a good word for someone. I was talking to a woman yesterday after a talk at a church, and she said, I like to talk to people in the store or just out and about and ask them, has anybody talked to you about Jesus lately? And I kind of smiled. I thought, that's kind of winsome way to bring up the subject, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've all got a way to present the gospel, get into, you might say, good trouble for the Lord. I've been listening to the book of Acts on audiobook. And as you get into, especially Paul's ministry, you see how often he gets into trouble, not because of anything he did that was wrong, but because he preached and defended the gospel, and it upset the worldly ways of Ephesus or other places. You know, it took away from the commerce generated from false worship in Ephesus. The people are making idols for artifice of the Ephesians and so on. It challenged the civil governments in some ways, although Paul was not a rebel. You know, he was not a violent revolutionary in any sense. So I think we need to be a little more daring and a little more aggressive in a positive sense in terms of God has not given us a spirit of being timid, but power, love, and a sound mind, as Paul told Timothy.
And again, we had a trip that we took last spring to Greece and Turkey. And when you go to Ephesus, you go to Philippi, you go to Corinth and different places, and you realize Paul was there and then in some cases gets chased out, or there's almost always a revival. And then very quickly, then there's a revolution. And when you drive it, or you, in one case, take a boat to it, you realize how long and tedious that was. Might have been very easy to give up, and we should have that same kind of dynamism. And I do appreciate the fact that you're saying, look, we're not saying we only are intellectual. You said we need more courage and wisdom and evangelism. We need more fervor and constancy in prayer and worship. We need more hospitality and generosity and less materialism or civility, less rancor. You go through all of that. But I thought for just a few minutes, let's take on Martin Lloyd-Jones, and I do that with some fear and trepidation because I have great respect for him, which I know you do as well. But he wrote a book called Revival. I don't quote it in the articles we wrote in Outlook that'll come out in December, but he does, I think, have the wrong view and see that in some respects, apologetics is just trying to make Christianity acceptable to the modern mind, whereas really apologetics, you say, is the attempt to show that Christianity is true. It's not just true for you, but it's true for all individuals. It's rational, it's compelling, and it's pertinent. And it does seem to me that apologetics and evangelism are one connected element, and those all are things that we need to use as we try to lead others to the Lord and as we pray for a revival.
Right. And I have this quote in the article where he says what he thinks apologetics is, and I think he was maybe exposed to some bad apologetics, which is basically fitting Christianity into what the intellectuals of the day already believe. But apologetics should be finding whatever truth is available in secular philosophy or even non-Christian religion, and then bringing it back into the Christian worldview where it belongs, and challenging the falsehood of secular philosophies and non-Christian religions. So in one way, it's trying to conserve whatever truth is already available in history and in culture, but then always challenging the false beliefs. You know, that classic verse from Colossians 2:8, see to it, Paul speaking, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. And Paul knew how to engage the philosophers. We certainly see that in Acts 17, 16 through 34. He knew what was right in their thinking. He even quotes some of the non-Christian philosophers. But he challenges their idolatry, and he challenges their wrong views of God and the human race very profoundly. So apologetics is not giving a secularized version of Christianity to the world so the world can accept it on its own terms. I mean, people who do that have accommodated. They're not really standing for the truth. And there are people out there who do this. We know that. And sometimes they get extremely popular. But that's not the goal or the role of a faithful student of Scripture or disciple of Christ at all. We have to be willing to be against the world for the world, in the spirit of Athanasius, basically, or Paul, or Jesus.
And again, when you're talking about Acts 17, he's standing in front of Mars Hill, and I've done that twice now when we had our trip, and just realized he's talking to these pagan philosophers, but nevertheless is not afraid to quote from one of their philosophers and then begin to show them, if you will, the error. And a lot of it goes back to a book written years ago, and something we say all the time by Arthur Holmes, all truth is God's truth. We shouldn't be afraid of that. And so that's really, in some respects, as you point out, how he retrieved truth from the pagan philosophers. But we need to come to a break. When we come back, I thought you have a very good quote from Francis Schaeffer, and you and I have both said before that we have a generation that knows not Schaeffer. So we're going to try to educate them a little bit on that, because he really talks about the fact that the Christian system is consistent. And then also, I think you would agree with me, because we've talked about this before with other people that do apologetics. This has become almost the golden age of apologetics. It's almost the golden age of archaeology. Sort of become almost the golden age of the relationship between science and Christianity, because a lot of that's coming our direction. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of those aspects of this. And if you find yourself interested in this area of apologetics, let me also open up the phones. Maybe you don't have a question, but I always like to leave the possibility that somebody just had this great question or read one of Doug Groothuis's books and maybe wanted to ask something. You're free to do so, but I also encourage you maybe to take some notes. Again, I'm usually a little reticent to talk about the fact of a magazine coming out, since it's only November and the December issue is not out yet. But given the fact we are talking about revival, I thought I'd hold up the issue of revival, and it's called The Rumblings of Revival, that will be coming soon. And by the way, that's a very good reason for you to support this ministry on a monthly basis, because we send this out to you that support this ministry. Of course, if you join at the Truth Team level, as we talked before, you also receive some of the booklets. And many of the things we talk about here on Point of View end up in some of those booklets as well. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Doug Groothuis right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I have been talking about an outlook that's coming out next month, but let's talk about what came out this month. I'm holding up my booklet right now, which is entitled A Biblical View on Political Violence. This is the November issue, and if you're part of the Truth Team, you receive that. And if you turn to the second to the last page on additional resources, you will notice that one of the two books I recommend is a book by Douglas Groothuis, Fire in the Streets, How You Can Confidently Respond to Incendiary Cultural Topics. Those of you watching online will hold up his book. We've done interviews on that as well. Perhaps one of the best books on this subject, looking at why we have fire in the streets, where did it come from, or what we can do to respond to that. Just a good example of the kind of cultural topics that Doug Groothuis writes about. And if he comes in studio sometime in the future, I always like to do this with some of our guests, put out all of their books, and it would take a lot of the table to put out all of the Doug Groothuis books, including the best one, certainly known as Christian Apologetics, now in its second edition. So as you will see, we have a link to his website. If you would like to contact him, maybe have him come and speak or teach at your school, that is the case. We have information about this article that appeared in the Worldview Bulletin newsletter, and in some respects, just think that these are ways that we can educate you, equip you, empower you to make a difference. And whether we have a revival or not, we're going to need to know how to think biblically about every area of life. And we need to, as we just shared a few minutes ago, make sure that we're not taken captive by false or hollow or deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition or the elementary spiritual forces of the world. Instead, we should be taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. But let's, if we can, Doug, get back to your very good article. And one of the things you do is quote from Francis Schaeffer, who makes the case that the Christian system is consistent with no other system that has ever been, because if indeed it is from God's revelation, every human system is going to fail. And you've spent a fair amount of time over the years critiquing world religions and cults, and oftentimes it's pretty easy to find the flaws, especially if you use the Bible as your thumb note or your plumb line or your ruler, whatever you want to use it, because those are, I think, the ideas that we need to actually evaluate every single day if we're going to think every thought captive and begin to make sure that we're thinking every thought after the obedience to Christ.
Well, I agree. And I have this quote from the God who is there, which I love. He says, "The Christian system is consistent as no other system has ever been. It is beautiful beyond words because it has a quality that no other system completely has. You begin at the beginning and you can go to the end. It is as simple as that. And every part and portion of the system can be related back to the beginning. Whatever you discuss, to understand it properly, you just go back to the beginning and the whole thing is in place. The beginning is simply that God exists and that he is a personal, infinite God. And of course, that he's revealed himself in the scripture and through Jesus Christ." So I've been doing apologetics and philosophy for a long time. I'm coming up on my 50th rebirthday in June of next year. And pretty much from the beginning, I started thinking about the Christian worldview, apologetics, other religions, cults, secular philosophies, and ended up getting 3 degrees in philosophy from secular schools and writing a number of books, 20 books now. And I can tell groups when I speak that I have investigated all the major religions and worldviews, and I find Christianity to be far and away intellectually superior to any and all of them. So I'm not saying that as a new convert or with some kind of bluster or arrogance. It's something that I've done. In my apologetics book, Christian Apologetics, A Comprehensive Case for Biblical Faith, is 852 pages. Now, I got some help from Rick Hess and Craig Blomberg, but I wrote about 90% of that. And it's something that I have engaged from the very beginning, because when I became a Christian, unlike some of my friends, I didn't have a profound religious experience. I confessed Christ as Lord, and I believed it, and I knew I needed to follow Christ. But I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel forgiveness. So I really had to work this out. Is this really true? And as I matured as a Christian, I began to have more of a emotionally rich understanding of the Christian life and so on, and really got the conviction that I was a Christian, that I knew I was a Christian. But I knew Christianity was true, I guess, before I was entirely sure that I was a Christian. I had to kind of grow into that, and the way I grew into that largely was through studying the case for Christianity and, of course, attending church, prayer, worship, fellowship, witnessing, all those kinds of things. So the reason that I teach philosophy and apologetics is because I think that the Christian message is objectively true, and then it can hold up in the marketplace of ideas. In as much as we have a marketplace of ideas anymore, it's sad, that so many ideas just get shut down or canceled.
Yes.
And we're not given the opportunity to actually debate and discuss these things from a reasonable and evidential viewpoint.
Let's, if we can, take on, and again, our Martin Lloyd-Jones mentions this a little bit, but it's a misconception people have before. You say it's not true that apologetics must rely on confirmation from secular sources. And in some cases, there have been well-meaning people that sometimes they say, well, the Bible doesn't say that, but the science says that, so it must mean the Bible believes that. But there is a sense in which right now, and we'll just use science for a moment as a good illustration, we would expect that the God of the Bible and the God of creation are the same, and that we would expect that as we understand more about the creation, it would fit more accurately with what we find in the Bible. And in some respects, that's what we're finding, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I think of the rise of the intelligent design movement in the last 35 years, and we've seen tremendous evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe that requires a mind behind it, that biology is full of information, and information comes from a mind. It doesn't come out of mindless matter. And we've seen a real development of the philosophy of science and scientific confirmation of creation of the universe, the design of the universe. You've got people like Stephen Meyer, his fantastic book, Return of the God Hypothesis, which really brings all that evidence together, came out 4 years ago. People like Bill Dembski and Mike Behe and others, Doug Axe doing some experimental work and so on. And I've been around, as you have, Kerby, for a long time in apologetics, and the case for God from creation just keeps getting stronger and stronger as the years go on. It's very encouraging.
And that title is, I think, instructive. Stephen Meyer's been on the program. Matter of fact, we think so highly of the book. I held up the booklet on political violence, but we did one a while back called Bible and Science, because we recognize that a lot of people might not be able to make their way through the Return of the God hypothesis. So in some respects, the booklet's like one of those cliff notes, if you will. But the Return of the God hypothesis is at the end of the 19th century. At Marx, Freud, Darwin, sort of like we've answered all the questions of where we came from, where we're going, what human beings are, and yet by the time you have gone through the 20th century now in the 21st century, as you point out, the God hypothesis that the atheists rejected, now you're coming back to a return of the God hypothesis, and this is a great time to be a Christian and a great time to be able to benefit from the fact that the heavens do indeed declare the glory of God, that when we go to Romans in the New Testament and it talks about the fact that the unbeliever is without excuse, there is a sense in which we are, in some respects, the inheritors of all the work that has been done in the area of science, and gives us a greater conviction that indeed we can speak about God as creator.
Well, absolutely. And the evidence is there. We don't have to be afraid of any discipline, any area of study. That's something Schaeffer wrote about as well. If Christianity is in fact true, then we can study the humanities or sciences or anything else and not worry about finding something that will contradict what Scripture says. That doesn't mean it's always going to be easy to understand the relationship of knowledge outside of the Bible and knowledge in the Bible. I mean, that's a lifelong task, really. but I found no contradictions, and I found many confirmations of the biblical worldview and biology and cosmology and psychology and all the rest of it. And the system, as Schaeffer said itself, is consistent because we don't live in a world of mere matter, energy, space, and time. We live in a designed world, a world that has not always existed. It was created at a point in time, and a world that was put here for a purpose, that we have a purpose.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, just thought I'd ask another question since we talk about science. What about archaeology? And most importantly, what about this? If indeed we have a revival, I think apologetics, evangelism and apologetics and good theology going to be really important. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Douglas Groothuis with us for a few more minutes as we talk about revival and apologetics. And Doug, one of the things that you also get into is the issue of archaeology. Turns out that, again, Martin Lloyd-Jones was kind of critical about the fact that we don't need to go to science to prove the Bible. We agree. You don't need to go to archaeology to prove that the Bible is historically accurate. But it is, I think, just one more example of if indeed the Bible is true, we would expect that archaeology would confirm the Bible, which it does. And when you look at other religious documents, oftentimes archaeology or history contradicts those religious items. And so it seems to me that if we can use history and archaeology to falsify false views, it would stand to reason that we would want to also use archaeology and history to verify what we see in the Bible, and that's exactly what we find.
Right, and I've never specialized in that particular discipline of archaeology. I've done a little bit of work on the historical basis for the New Testament in terms of documents, and I've mentioned a bit in a few of my books about archaeological confirmations. But you're right, in terms of other religions, archaeologists don't go, I don't think, to any Buddhist scriptures or Hindu scriptures for their archaeological digs, because they really traffic in myths and stories and spiritual ideas, whereas the Bible talks about history, objects, events, political leaders, rivers, seas, mountains, places, events. So you can go to those places, as you have on your tours, and see where Paul was and walk where Jesus walked. And the archaeologist can take that as a guide to know where to set up a dig. And you can correlate the findings in these objects. History deals with objects and documents, and match it up with Scripture. And to my knowledge, there's never been any contradiction of anything in Scripture found in archaeology, and there's been a lot of confirmation as opposed to contradiction. And of course, you can't verify everything through archaeology. There's just too much that's mentioned, but that's not a defect at all. It would just be impossible to confirm everything, and everything doesn't have to be confirmed because we have a lot of facts that line up with what's in Scripture from archaeology and all the rest. And if something isn't, in a sense, doubly attested, from the Bible and from some other source, it doesn't mean it's untrue.
And again, those are the kinds of things that are encouraging. Again, we can see, for example, we had people at the Pool of Siloam, first time it's uncovered in 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. We're going to have some future interviews we're going to do with individuals that have written books on archaeology, so certainly that's another verification. But as we come down to this issue of apologetics and revival, it does seem to me that whether we are headed towards a time of spiritual awakening or revival, or whether we're going to go into a more dark period in American history and even in world history, either case, we really need to understand how important it is to have a biblical worldview because, as you pointed out, with our course quote from Colossians 2:8, we cannot allow ourselves to be taken captive by false philosophy and false ideas. And that's certainly one of the reasons why you have been involved in apologetics for some time. That's why you're a professor of apologetics and Christian worldview at Cornerstone University. And I thought for just a minute, as people go to your website, DouglasGroothuis.com. Don't even have to know how to spell his last name. It's all there on the website. Features, of course, Christian apologetics. I thought maybe for a minute you might talk about what is going on there at Cornerstone University. But also, even though you're no longer at Denver Seminary, you've got all these videos where people can actually download some of the videos. They can download class materials. There's just all sorts of material that is available so that people can be self-educated. And quite frankly, when you and I first set out to start studying apologetics, it's kind of Francis Schaeffer, maybe it was Norm Geisler, maybe a few others. That was it. Yeah. But now there's just so much good material, and a lot of it's on your website.
Mm-hmm. Well, we try to make available as much as we can, and I think I've got about 10 hours of really well-produced apologetics videos that are free, and I've got, 10 or 15 syllabi from courses that I've taught over the years on apologetics related to C.S. Lewis and Blaise Pascal, faith and science, basic apologetics courses, ethics, all the rest of it. So there's a lot available. There's a lot of my lectures on YouTube also. And if you go to my webpage, DouglasGroothuis.com, you can get a free blog. Sign up for that. I put out 2 or 3 a month of my commentaries on various issues that we find, try to do that from a biblical worldview. And it's not active right now, but there's about 3 years worth of podcasts on my podcast called Truth Tribe. We're hoping to restart that at some point, but they're still out there. So there's, about 150 episodes of that, which are also free. I just try to make available as much as I can.
I just was going to jump in because even though the podcast is old, the blog is new because one of them is on Zohran Mamdani, which we'll be talking about next hour.
Yeah.
One's on Charlie Kirk.
Yeah.
One is on just the lyrics to Indescribable by Chris Tomlin. So it's kind of all over the map. And I would be remiss if I did not mention how much you love jazz. So anybody out there that loves jazz certainly can benefit. And you've written even all sections of material on that as well. So there is a lot that people can get when they actually click on that website and find some of that information, isn't there?
Yeah, I did several podcasts on jazz, and those were the least popular of all of them.
Well, we
but
tried.
I like doing it.
We've had you on the program to talk about that as well. Whether you're talking about the New Age movement, whether you're talking about some of the cultural topics, whether you're talking about, of course, this whole idea of revival, there are just so many great resources by Doug Groothuis. And again, I would commend to you any of his books. But if you really want to see kind of his magnum opus, of course, that is his book, Christian Apologetics, the second edition. Lots of great material there. And Doug, it's always great to have you on the program. And again, if people wanted to know a little bit more about you, they can go to the website. If they'd like to know more about Cornerstone University, I've spoken there before and had no idea when I was speaking that someday that would be where you would be a professor.
Yeah.
So I would commend it to especially individuals living in the Midwest because it's right there in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Well, absolutely. We have a thriving undergrad program. We have a theological seminary. And one of the things that I do is that I supervise the faculty and encourage them to teach everything from a Christian worldview. That's one of our distinctives. And you can be a Christian school in name and that not necessarily be the case with the research of the professors or the teachers, the teaching of the professors. But we make that a requirement, and we really work hard on that.
Again, let me just mention we have a link to your website. We, of course, have a link to Facebook. We have a link to Twitter, or now called X. And so go to the website, pointofview.net, and everything you need is right there. Doug, as always, thank you so very much. And as well, I'll look forward to the next opportunity.
Okay, you're welcome, Kirby. Thank you.
Just before we take a break, let me mention next hour we're going to get back into the news. We might actually have the end of a shutdown. Don't count it yet, but I think it's going to happen. But we've already made it the longest one in history, so we're going to talk about that. We mentioned Zohran Mamdani. There's a very good piece by Peggy Noonan, also one by John Puri that we'll get into as well. But if you find yourself saying, well, I would like to hear this again, or I know somebody that would enjoy this, you can click on the button that says watch or listen, or you can go to the button that says see more, and you can find under his picture there the article Revival and Apologetics. We make it available to you. You don't even have to have a subscription to the Worldview Bulletin, which is where it comes from, but I would recommend that you might consider that. And then when we come back, we're going to post some other articles and get some commentary on that as well. Certainly enjoyed my time last week in New Mexico and Colorado. Great to be back here in the Dallas area. We'll be back right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's, if we can, give you a chance if you would like to ask a question or make a comment. First of all, I want to talk about the military. Today, November 10th, is the 250th anniversary of the Marine Corps. Semper Fi. Started, interesting enough, November 10th, 1775. So again, very significant in that particular date. And again, that they're having all sorts of birthday ball and cake cutting ceremonies and all sorts of things I'm learning about. Tomorrow is Veterans Day. So again, we want to honor those of you that are veterans, which comes, of course, from Armistice Day. We'll say more about that tomorrow. So I just wanted to real quickly acknowledge those of you that are serving in the military, even if you have not served in the military, your family members or others that have. And so, again, wanted to just have that shout out before we get into all the issues in the news. And I think the biggest news in some respects, although I don't want to overplay it because there's some other things we want to talk about that I think are also significant, is the fact that Sunday night you finally had the Senate vote to break the filibuster. The vote on the filibuster is 60 votes, and just barely 60 to 40. And it also required some Republicans to come in at the last moment, along with 8 members of the Democratic caucus who are now being criticized. And, of course, the fact that that was allowed, there are people calling for Chuck Schumer, who is the Senate Minority Leader, to step down. But the argument, which was, I think, the breaking point, was to say that on, I think, Truth Social, if I remember right, President Trump said, well, if we're going to even have a vote on this issue of health care subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, which has never been affordable, some people call it a Ponzi scheme, but I'll leave that for another debate, another discussion, especially when we have Dr. Merrill Matthews around, since he's kind of the expert on that. But nevertheless, if we're going to have a vote on the health care subsidies, Trump said at least would be willing to consider this if you paid the people, not the pharmaceutical companies, not the various insurance companies. Okay. Made sense to me, especially since, as I pointed out to you before, if you've been listening, many of these subsidies go to people that, quite frankly, would benefit from it but don't necessarily need it. We will get into that in the future. So that was enough to maybe break the logjam. We still, of course, have to have the final vote and goes to the House, but some people are thinking maybe by Wednesday we actually have the functioning of the government again. And, of course, then that raises some questions about back pay and all the kinds of things that are there. And one of the big issues has been the issue of SNAP, which stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. We oftentimes just have referred to it in the past because that's what it used to be called, food stamps. And on Friday night, the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson issued an emergency ruling to temporarily block a federal judge's ruling that required President Trump's administration to distribute SNAP benefits during the shutdown. And so what that did was put a stay on the lower court ruling for 48 hours. And if you do the math, we're back to where we are. But of course, if indeed we can get the government running again and some kind of continuing resolution is accepted, which it looks like it will, then the SNAP program will be implemented. But for those of you that are waiting for those food stamps and those benefits, the reality is, first you have to get the Department of Agriculture back in session. You have to get all the people there. You probably have a massive backlog. So anyway, it's not a done deal, but pretty much. So we're headed in that direction. Now, the reaction to this has been, as you might imagine, very interesting, because there are individuals who have been encouraged to hold out as long as possible. And by the time we now have today would be 41st day, probably nothing happens till Wednesday, so it could be 43 days of a shutdown. The best evidence I have right now is that Senate was adjourned till 8 a.m. their time today. So there are still multiple votes necessary to open the government. Then Speaker Mike Johnson was saying he was hoping to have the House vote by Wednesday. And so, in some respects, yes, we have a light at the end of the tunnel, but we're still in the tunnel. As many people have pointed out, until that final vote is Wednesday, and as slow as Congress moves, there's kind of a glacial movement of Congress sometimes. It could even go into Thursday. And so everything from the chaos at the airports to all sorts of government subsidies still are not happening, but at least we're heading in that direction. I thought, just before we take a break, just give you a few comments here. Hakeem Jeffries, we will not support spending legislation advanced by Senate Republicans that fails to extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits. If Hakeem Jeffries can hold the Democrats as much as Nancy Pelosi, who's now stepping down, can hold it, then it would mean you, on the point of Mike Johnson, would need every single Republican vote, which is always a little bit iffy. So we still may not be where we need there yet. One of the individuals, interestingly enough, is Scott Jennings. He's been on CNN, and he said Democrats put SNAP benefits through a bunch of pain and anxiety for literally nothing. And then he says in all caps, nothing. All political nonsense, just insanely irresponsible. And after 41 days, if you have not taken the time to contact your member of Congress on the Prevent Government Shutdowns Act of 2025, whether Republicans do it or Democrats do it, it makes no sense, and it's political theater, and you can see how these two very long, by the way, the two longest shutdowns in modern times, they've both been by Democrats. Really, one of the longest shutdowns and filibusters happened in the 1960s when Democrats were trying to prevent the Civil Rights Act, but that's another story for another day. And so right now, there are all sorts of people. David Santa Carla says the liberals are melting down that Democrats caved. At least that's the arguments they're making right there as well. And I thought it was interesting that Stephen Miller, you know who he is, in the Trump White House, the Trump who loves government is really upset that John Fetterman, he's the senator from Pennsylvania, a stroke survivor, just reopened the government with his vote because he, I think, became the 90th vote. And so the funding, if indeed this is voted through, will fund appropriations for agriculture, veterans, military construction, and things like that through January 30th, that's 2026. The vote right now on ACA will be determined, and SNAP funding really will continue, as I understand it, through September 30th, 2026. So we'll see how all these votes go. I probably told you more than you wanted to know, but it illustrates again that when you shut down the government, a lot of people get hurt, and the members of Congress still get paid. Isn't that interesting? We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What does it mean to be a human being? That is a question raised in Psalm 8. What is man? That question is at the heart of so many social issues such as human rights, gender, sexuality, and artificial intelligence. Dr. Carl Trueman discusses the issue of biblical anthropology in his article in World Magazine. He was on my radio program to discuss the topic by pointing to books that helped him more accurately define a human being. Augustine's Confessions is the first book he mentioned. Augustine, he says, successfully integrates theology, experience, and doxology into his autobiography in a way unmatched by any before or since. His work contradicts the modern idea that to be truly human is to be autonomous, unencumbered self-creators. A second book is Blaise Pascal's Pensées. While Pascal draws from Augustine's anthropology, he brings a modern perspective. His commentary on the materialistic culture of the 17th century French court has many parallels with our entertainment-obsessed world. Why does the king have a jester? Because he fears death, and having nothing else to worry about due to his material wealth and power, needs to be distracted from his mortality. The book, What It Means to Be Human by Carter Snead, is a book of bioethics. It also reminds us that human beings are not defined by autonomy, but obligation and dependency. We should see the body and human embodiment as morally significant. Christians must reject this modern secular worldview that does not see humans as created in the image of God. These books and others he mentions in the article are helpful in bringing us back to a biblical perspective of what it means to be a human being. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Our next article on the website at pointofview.net is Take Mondami Seriously and Literally. It's written by Peggy Noonan. When she was last here in Dallas speaking at an event, they asked if I would introduce her, which I was glad to do. And she, of course, has been a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. And I would have to say that even though she holds to conservative views, recently there was something she wrote, and Gary Bauer said, "Peggy, please stop writing. I don't like some of the things you're saying." So I recognize that sometimes she's hard to pin down in terms of her political philosophy, but she is a great writer and a great speechwriter, and she is really warning individuals to take seriously what an individual says, and then even more importantly, some of the things he says after he's elected, and that'll bring us to Van Jones in just a minute. And so this article, and then one I've got by John Puri, The Most Terrifying Words in the English Language, we'll get to in just a minute. But first of all, she points out that politics sometimes is a pendulum. Sometimes we swing to the left, we swing to the right. She says in 1932, it was a lurch to the left from the presidency on down. Part of that was because of the Great Depression. 1980, a lurch to the right. She's well aware of that, having been with Ronald Reagan there and saw what was happening. And she says, we don't necessarily like it because she says an aspect of our modern, what she says, conservative disposition is that we like the arts, culture, even technology to be interesting and exciting, but we prefer that government be boring, kind of a stabilizing force while we act up in other areas. but she says it's never boring now, certainly won't be in this century. And so, again, that's maybe her comment about Trump, but also just the general necessary aspect of that as well. Goes on to talk about some warnings she's issued, but now she says that if nothing else, what we're dealing with is this constant drumbeat of what's called affordability. Somewhere on some focus group worked with Democrats, they found that the word that they want to keep using is affordability. And they use it all the time. Elizabeth Warren uses it all the time. Zohran Mamdani uses it all the time. And so she says, obviously, what we used to call the high cost of everything now is the idea that government isn't doing enough in this area. By the way, I've got a very good piece that we'll be talking about tomorrow about an open letter to Bill Maher. Bill Maher is the atheist, but Bill Maher on his program over the weekend was asking all sorts of questions about why does the economy not seem to work, and why now have New York residents elected a socialist Muslim. And I think the argument that you will see economically is the case. But nevertheless, we are where we are, and now we no longer have a situation in which back not so long ago we had a very conservative Democrat for mayor. Now you have Zohran Mamdani, who she says got the mandate he wanted, and it was big. He broke past 50% in a three-man race as a declared, not hidden socialist, the first such mayor in New York. He did this at age 34 with no real resume as a Muslim, again a first, and a most extraordinary achievement. And they said, you know, if nothing else, don't think that he's going to talk about a lot of things and then not necessarily do much, because she points out that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when elected, thought she was on the magazine covers, did TikTok rants, but really didn't accomplish much, partially because of Nancy Pelosi. Mr. Mamdani won't take a page from that book, she says. He's as serious as a heart attack. He told us in his victory speech, this man who 6 months ago was unknown to the vast majority of New Yorkers and 10 months ago was polling at 1%. Was he humbled by New York's open-minded, open-hearted embrace? She says, not in the least. He delivered a declaration of dominance. To get to any of us, you have to get through us. Billionaires can play by the same rules as the rest of us. By the way, again, these are obvious statements, but the way it is, we're going to put an end to the culture of corruption. We will prove that there is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about, and declared a new age. I love Peggy Noonan. She says, he made Barack Obama look modest and self-effacing. Gotta love that. And she's not the only one that noticed. Van Jones. Remember Van Jones? Okay, you know, here's an individual that worked under Barack Obama. He's watching this live on CNN. First words out of his mouth, I think, were, I felt like it was a little bit of a character switch here. During the campaign, she says, Mr. Mamdani was a warm, embracing fellow with a dimpled smile who loved everyone with an undifferentiated warmth. The night he won, he showed who he was, a serious ideologue who means it. In a day after interview in the New York Times, he spoke of the size of his win. Quote, it is a mandate to deliver on the agenda that we ran on, unquote. And then the conversation turned to his plan to raise taxes on the wealthy. And as a matter of fact, the Times headline, don't take my word for it, New York Times editor's headline was, the emboldened Mamdani sheds conciliatory tone. And so here we go. Now, she says, a good guess, he says, I won't think he'll start out as a moderate, obviously, but he will be clever. And maybe a focus on city services like something like garbage collection, knowing that he can lose it all if he shows incompetence on the basic. And he won't quickly try to impose all the Democratic Socialists of America's criminal justice agenda. But over time, he'll kind of start wearing away individuals. And as months go by, he'll be an inch-by-inch bulldozer. I disagree. I think she is hoping that he will run into this vast New York City bureaucracy and recognizing that he doesn't want to expend all of his political capital. I don't think he is patient enough but we'll see. And then, of course, the economic agenda is to hike taxes on millionaires, billionaires, corporations, whatever. Nobody minds if he gets another $5 million a year out of a billionaire. Matter of fact, a billionaire, she says, might not even notice. And then talks about the fact that eventually some of them may begin to have questions. They may, for now, say, it's the price of doing business in New York City, but the argument is going to run against them because she says there are going to be many that all cheer that on. Why should anyone have a $1 million apartment when homeless sleep on the streets? And the point she makes as well is, don't just think that he's going to run on his election. He's going to run with volunteers. There will be some very interesting aspects to his rule, she says. Mr. Mamdani didn't just have 1 million votes. He had 100,000 volunteers. The young who supported him won't disappear. They will do everything they can to help him. Many are unemployed for many reasons. They volunteer at public grocery stores. They'll make lettuce chic. They'll haul sacks of sweet potatoes through Park Slope. Their hedge fund fathers will say, I sent him to Brown for this, but a lot of will be moved and cheer them on. And so she says Republicans should understand Mr. Mamdani isn't your boogeyman to use for your electoral amusement. You think you're going to make him the face of the Democratic Party in that stupid phrase, and everyone will hate Democrats and you'll profit without even trying. But he's cleverer than you. He understands the world of right now. In any case, he has an ideology that he swallowed whole at his father's knee with his mother's milk and has fully absorbed and digested it. He thinks he knows the historical meaning, do you? And so I think still, if he does what we think he's going to do, he will become the face of the Democratic Party, but she may be right. She's been very good at estimating that. And so she ends by saying, take him both literally and seriously. Which brings me to my other piece, because this is by John Puri, who said, Ronald Reagan famously said in 1986, I think you all know what I've always felt are the 9 most terrifying words in the English language. And they are, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. And the illustration that he uses is when you have Zoran Mamdani say, we will prove that there is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about. Those are the kind of phrases you hear from authoritarianism. These are the kind of things that you hear sometimes from a dictator. And although they want to argue that that's what Donald Trump is all about, it's really not. But here he says this is genuinely one of the more horrifying quotes I've ever heard from a politician. There's no problem too big we can't actually address it, and no concern too small to care about. Which is why in, again, one of the upcoming booklets we have coming out is on the book The Road to Serfdom, which is written by Friedrich Hayek. I know most people will never read the book, but it's a critique of socialism and a critique of this very kind of attitude and idea. It's one of the many reasons to join the Truth Team, because it's the kind of booklets we send out on a regular basis. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Again, we've got just a few more things to cover in this last half hour. Let me just mention as a program note that tomorrow, David Geisler will be with us. This book that came out many years ago. I've got the original version, and I was doing a comparison between the one that I have on my shelf and the one that's just come out, which is newly revised. There's a whole chapter that is not in my book, so I'm going to read that one tonight, along with, of course, I've had the book on my shelf since, I think it came out in 2008, but this newly revised version is one that will get into why we need to believe the Bible is the Word of God, why we need to believe in inerrancy, why we need to be able to defend the Bible, and I think you'll really enjoy the conversation because not only does David Geisler hold to all the apologetics of his father, but he also is really just kind of a master at evangelism. If you really wanted to learn about conversational evangelism, he'd be one of the best you could ever sit under for his teaching there. So we'll get into that, get back into some of the issues in the news, and I thought I would just mention that real quickly in that regard. But let's, if we can, talk about some of the other political issues. Got a piece by Victor Davis Hanson on chaos strategy. We'll explain that. And one by Hunger about Cal Thomas called The Hunger Games, creatively titled. And in the last segment, yeah, it's about time to come back to something we talked about on Wednesday when we were talking about this whole idea of Zionism and Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes and some of the statements being made by Kevin Roberts at the Heritage Foundation and the rest. And there'll be some other times to talk about that as well, but I just wanted to try to close that loop a little bit as well. But first of all, Victor Davis Hanson reminds us that sometimes what we see as chaos is not a bug, it's a feature, as they like to say. It wasn't accidental, it was intentional. And he has about 5 key points. Point number 1 is this: democratic chaotic nihilism still works. This idea of chaos strategy sometimes is something that has been implemented, and you see that out there on the streets. You know, just a few minutes ago, I mentioned, of course, Doug Groothuis' book, Fire on the Streets, and you can see some of that playing out in terms of protest, attacking of ICE agents, and all of the rest. So part of it is it works because it helps gin up any kind of support to help with these off-year elections, and will be implemented again for next year's midterm elections. Anyway, that's number 1. Number 2, every day of Trump's first year, there was either campus eruptions, Tesla firebombings, street violence against ICE, or crazy district judges' injunctions. In other words, that chaos almost is intended. And then he goes on to talk about she, meaning Nancy Pelosi, even uses it to gin up more by saying President Donald Trump is just a vile creature, the worst thing on the face of the earth. Now, even if a Republican member of Congress disagreed with a Democrat, I don't think you would get something that awful said about a Democrat, and yet she said that virtually with impunity. And she says the public has no time to sort out the actual causes for such mad hattery. But it knows only the Democrats are basically saying that all this commotion is due to Trump. When in doubt, blame Trump. And we kind of figured that out. Number 3, he says Democrats also use the chaos strategy to target key electoral groups. In this week's election, which just took place, Republicans finally grasped the purpose of the pre-election shutdown. It was designed to galvanize key constituencies to get the vote out in a low turnout year. This time last week, there didn't look like there was any chance of there being a end of the shutdown. Why? Because the next day was the election. Now, less than a week after the election, we have people willing to say, okay, we can shut it down. And he reminds us that, again, you might see this as just background noise, or you might see it as a bug, but no, it's a feature. And he goes on to point out that there are also the attempt to identify ways in which we can bring the Hispanic vote back to the Democratic Party. And, of course, even though, as he points points out 70 to 80% of the deportations taking place right now are either individuals with criminal records or have prior deportation orders. The nonstop violent protests, the nullification threats from blue city officials, the slanted media coverage helps people not think through what really is taking place because ICE, as he says, is reduced to the Gestapo. And so once you start seeing that, as he points out, one of the things that this administration and members of that party need to talk about are any positive news of GDP growth, tolerable inflation, massive foreign investment, a calmer Middle East, numerous miraculous ceasefires around the globe. Those just sort of get lost. And even for every once in a while, when you have the president say that, or a press secretary say that, or maybe a member of the House or Senate say that, you go, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. And that's, of course, another point that he makes in terms of the chaos strategy. Number 4, much of the Trump agenda, other than spectacular military recruitment and a secure border, is more long-term. And that's why he points out that, we're not going to necessarily be able to gin up energy production overnight, not going to be able to trim all the federal workforce right away. We're not going to be able to deregulate everything right away. And so in some respects, it's going to take some time. And the impatient American voter may not be willing to wait that. And then finally, he just simply says, this is no longer the Democratic Party. You can threaten a political opponent with assassination. You can brag about killing his kids. You can tattoo a 3rd Panzer SS Division death head insignia on your chest. And you can promise to arrest a foreign head of state when he visits your city and boast about grabbing the means of production, and you still get the votes. I think it's just a reminder that this strategy has been very effective. And this is really a short summary of a very lengthy article, once again, well written by Victor Davis Hanson. But I wanted to leave time just before we end this segment by talking about Cal Thomas's piece, because one of the things we've learned over the last couple of weeks is once the government shut down, we were recognizing there was going to be a shutdown of SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as food stamps. And we now found out that there are 42 million people receiving food aid from SNAP. That's more than 12% of the U.S. population, according to the USDA. And he says now might be a good time to ask why so many Americans seek food assistance. And the starting point would be to get support, at least from the Republicans, on the elimination of mistakes, waste, and fraud, because you have the Department of Agriculture, and the Secretary of Agriculture came out and said this the other day, that she recognizes that at least 11 to 12% of SNAP benefits were improper payments, most of which are fraud, and that is the case. Cal Thomas reminds us that this food assistance program was developed in 1939 during the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Like so many government programs, when the Depression ended and the need for food assistance subsided, the programs continued and new people were added even during periods of prosperity. And if you looked at the numbers, they have grown dramatically. And so he says following the elimination of these improper payments should also be a focus on whether or not able-bodied people who are not working should be receiving that, at least by requiring a work and job training. And I've had some people say, I know how much work it was for me to get any kind of food assistance. How did this happen? Well, it happens more in blue states than red states, but it's still happening. And he says too many Americans believe they are entitled to other people's money, and that it's the government's responsibility to take care of every citizen and even non-citizen from cradle to grave. And he says maybe Congress should be listed among those who are non-essential and have their pay suspended. Watch how quickly the government would open again should that occur. And maybe we don't have to suspend their pay, but one more time, let me just mention, as we've gone through the longest shutdown in history, our middle section of our website, Take Action, Prevent Government Shutdowns Act of 2025. If you thought we needed it when this all began in October, I hope you can see we really need it now. This is outrageous. It has taken too long, and people are getting hurt. And this is something we want to talk about even tomorrow, because there are going to be residual effects to the shutdown that aren't just going to affect people getting SNAP benefits, not just affecting people wanting to fly out of an airport, I should say, but also going to affect you and your finances. But we'll talk about some of that tomorrow. Let's take a break, though. The education of Kevin Roberts at Heritage Foundation and Tucker Carlson, that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's so we can get to the last article, the education of Kevin Roberts. You might say, well, I don't even know who he is. Well, he is the president of the Heritage Foundation. You probably know who he is now because he decided to put out a video in which, after there was criticism of Tucker Carlson doing interviews with Nick Fuentes, a Hitler fanboy, as some people refer to him, an individual that thought Hitler was cool, like Stalin, and is really just a difficult individual to even think about doing an interview with. And Tucker Carlson does this interview with no problem, always with the idea, well, I'm just asking questions. And that is repugnant enough, so much so, by the way, that you can't go anywhere in media without seeing somebody referring to this. For example, Bill Maher, who was on Friday night, brings this up and talks about Tucker Carlson interviewing Nick Fuentes, and then says Kevin Roberts, whoever that is, but he does know he's with the Heritage Foundation, made a comment about that, goes on and says, well, we've always seen the problem with anti-Semitism on the left, and he's honest enough to call that out, but now we have this evidence of anti-Semitism on the right. Then you go to even the day before, a piece by Joel Rosenberg where he did the entire program, in a sense, trying to address some of I guess he did that on Saturday as well, on his Saturday program, trying to address this issue of Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, and all the things that were said there, once again calling out the, if you will, anti-Semitism on the right. And then Mark Levin does it on Sunday, in which he also addresses the issue, then brings on Ted Cruz to address the issue, and then Governor Ron DeSantis on. After a while, you're saying this is a lot longer, and I think it's going to have some staying power for some time. So the reason we bring it up is because it's an illustration of the fact that this is something that needs to be addressed. And Senator Ted Cruz said something that Republican senators and some members of Congress in the House are really afraid to address this issue. And the argument being made by Mark Levin and by Ted Cruz is, if we don't address this, it's going to destroy the Republican Party the way it's destroyed the Democratic Party. There have been entirely too many people in the Democratic Party that have allowed anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish ideas, or even as we were talking just the other day with our guest on Wednesday, just why don't we just call it what it is, anti-Jew or Jew hatred, and as a result, that certainly is the case. Well, the video, again, was one that maybe you, on hindsight, should never have done. But nevertheless, Roger Kimball puts it this way. He says, I'm confident that when Kevin Roberts, president of that venerable bastion of conservatism, that'd be the Heritage Foundation, got outside his morning egg on October 30th, he had no inkling that his 2-minute and 30-second video clip would precipitate a seismic detonation that would rock the foundation and monopolize the news cycle for days. Of course, the main purpose of the video, according to Kevin Roberts, was to reaffirm his commitment to Tucker Carlson, who remains and always will be a close friend of the Heritage Foundation. And this, of course, came on the interview, after the interview with Nick Fuentes. And, of course, others have now been criticizing him. Many commentators have. And he tried to walk back some of the things that he said there as well. One of his first moves was to dump his chief of staff, which is not a good look, and then blame the audience. Not as many people as I thought were ready for a little bit of nuance, he said in his first response to the criticism. When that didn't work, Kevin Roberts then said, well, sometimes you can make a mistake with the best of intentions. My mistake was not saying that we aren't going to participate in cancel culture. We're not. The mistake was letting that override the central motivation that I had, which was fighting against anti-Semitism in all its forms. Well, you're starting to see articles which have the title, The Heritage Foundation's Meltdown, or the article I've posted here from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, The Education of Heritage Foundation's Kevin Roberts. And you now have the Anti-Semitism Task Force that has always existed at the Heritage Foundation actually has severed ties with the organization. So, again, one of those individuals, Victoria Coates, I'd like to get her on maybe. Not real eager to get anybody on from the Heritage Foundation, but somebody who's working on anti-Semitism. Yeah, we're all about that. And so if nothing else, we can see that there are some that are saying that this is a self-inflicted wound. And as a result, some of the more sympathetic commentators still are saying after 40-plus years, they ran a headline saying the Heritage Foundation is collapsing. Maybe not so much. And, of course, then you've had some various groups, including, of course, the Wall Street Journal, who are already not thrilled with the fact that Kevin Roberts has closely aligned the Heritage Foundation with what you might call the MAGA world or Trump. As a matter of fact, this particular article, interesting enough, by Robert Kimball, says it's no secret that the Journal does not like MAGA World. It does not like Trump's immigration policy, either regarding the border or of the immigration, immigrants, and all the rest. Does not like his immigration policies regarding tariffs and all the rest. So, yes, you can already get that idea as well. But he points out that Kevin Roberts is not moving any more aggressively to align the Heritage Foundation with Trump's Make America Great Again movement than the late Edwin Fulner, who was there when I used to occasionally use their facilities, and he was the founder and longtime leader who did try to at least link up with Ronald Reagan's version of the same agenda. And again, when we talk about the Heritage Foundation, long before we had some of the kind of equipment we have today, if I was in Washington, D.C. and wanted to do a broadcast for Point of View, because I had so many good friends that were at that time at the Heritage Foundation, others that have gone on to the Ethics and Public Policy Center, some who've just gone on to be with the Lord, but nevertheless, they opened it up for me to do broadcasts from the Heritage Foundation studio. So although I have some concerns about some of the things being said right now, we have some fond memories in the past of the Heritage Foundation and certainly appreciate many of the articles that they have produced over the years. But this was a self-inflicted wound that was not necessary. And so that's why Roger Kimball says Kevin Roberts ought to have run a rhetorical Geiger counter over his original script. You think? But nevertheless, I did want to address that. It sort of came up on Wednesday because we talked about this particular book that really got into everything from Tucker Carlson and his interview with Ted Cruz, Tucker Carlson, his interview with Nick Fuentes and all of that, and then just the whole criticism of what's called Christian Zionism, criticizing Mike Huckabee or people like Joel Rosenberg and all the rest. So it was something we did address on Wednesday, and we will probably address it again, probably on our Friday weekend edition. We'll see how things are playing out there. But I do agree with Mark Levin, Ted Cruz, as well as Governor Ron DeSantis, and that is, this is something that needs to be addressed. There has been too much of a willingness to allow individuals who call themselves conservative, who have some really despicable anti-Semitic comments being made, and then somehow wrap themselves in the flag. So again, these are the kinds of things we will talk about here on Point of View. As I said, no issues off the table, and we illustrated that a Friday ago when we talked about it. We illustrated it last Wednesday, and we illustrated it again here on Monday, and that's not the last time we'll probably talk about it, but if you want to read more, it's on the website at pointofview.net. Looking forward to our conversation with David Geisler tomorrow. I think you will enjoy that conversation as well. It's good to be back in the studio. Good to see Megan and Steve. Thank you for your work. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
Well, it's always good to see your smiling face here and all that. Okay, a couple things. First of all, this is based on the assumption that the shutdown will be over by next Monday. So if we get later in the week and we're going, I don't know, then this might not work. All I could change is one comment there. And also, because it's kind of economic stuff,